You're recording now?
Yeah, now we're recording, and I'll be heading off and.
But we're not live though now, right?
We're not live yet, though. Yeah.
Okay,
Thanks.
just
Bye-bye.
triple checking. Okay.
What happens again when we go live?
Oh, you don't have to do anything. Once we go
Okay.
live, I will say, hi, I'm Caroline of Mighty Blaze, and then I will introduce you, and then I will start asking you all these questions that you can answer. I have to tell you, I was looking all through my shelves because I have a first edition of The Good Mother, and I remember with the old cover, and I remember when that book came out, it upturned everything I thought about writing because it was so amazing. And you had this amazing story to go along with it, where all of a sudden you were this literary star, but the book was it was just so great. And I have it someplace here, and I'm so sorry I couldn't bring it up because the cover, you'll see the cover's all dog-eared, and it's because I've read it.
Mine too. Yeah, it's been around for a very long time. And in fact, I think that was my most successful book. So if you actually tracked my career, I sort of seemed to come out of nowhere, rising up like this, and then slowly comes down after that. Little notches here and there with a little more success.
But it was so great.
Fantastically successful that it was just strange. I mean, it was so unanticipated on my part, and
that's interesting. That's something I would like to hear about, because like one of the things that I wanted to talk about is that I read that when you just recently changed publishers and editors, and they said that when you wrote to a different, we're now streaming live. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Caroline Leavitt. I'm the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze. And I am so completely thrilled and so completely honored to have Sue Miller here to talk about her new book, Monogamy, which I have to tell you, if you haven't read it, you have to go out and don't just buy one copy of it, buy several copies of it, because you're going to want to give it to your friends, because you're going to want to talk about it a lot. It's an extraordinary book. It's an absolutely extraordinary book. In fact, I wanted to read from the New York Times, a review by Richard Russo. He said, "This is the slow burn of a novel that allows readers to dream deeply." Isn't that amazing? That's an amazing kind of quote. Book Page has said, "How great is Monogamy? If it's not Miller's best novel, it surely is among her very best. One measure of that is how the experience of it deepens with each reading." And that's true. And I also want to say, as somebody who does look at Goodreads reviews and Amazon, I haven't seen one bad review. I have not seen anything but people just being unabashedly in love. So here's the official bio. Both critically acclaimed and loved by readers, Sue Miller is recognized internationally for her elegant and realistic accounts of the contemporary family. Her books have been translated and published in 22 countries around the world. The Good Mother, her first novel in 1986, was an immediate bestseller. It was more than 6 months at the top of the New York Times chart. Subsequent novels include 3 Book of the Month main selections: Family Pictures, which was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award; While I Was Gone, an Oprah's Book Club selection, which is also a wonderful, wonderful book. I love that book; and The Senator's Wife; and The Arsonist. Her nonfiction book, The Story of My Father, was heralded by Book Page as a beautiful spare memoir about her relationship with her father during his illness and death from Alzheimer's disease. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim, a Radcliffe Institute Fellowship. She's on the board of Penn American Center, and for 4 years, she was the chair of Penn New England, an active branch that worked with writing programs in local high schools, and she ran classes in prisons. She's one of our true literary legends, and I'm just thrilled to have you here, Sue. Thank you so much for coming here.
I'm so glad to be here, and thank you for reading those.
So I have a lot to talk about this book. It seems to me that this book and all of your books really fit the metaphor of, an iceberg where you see the tip and the real richness is all under the water. I feel like you're more interested in everything that we can't see that's still there flowing underneath. And I think that monogamy, for me anyway, is very much looking at that iceberg of marriage, what we see on the outside and what's really holding it in place. The things we can't see are the things we see, but not in their whole truth. And we get that truth through a variety of characters. We have Graham and Annie, who have had a really long, seemingly happy marriage, and then Graham dies, and Annie finds out things that she did not expect to find, which just derails everything she ever thought about her marriage and herself and her husband. So what I loved about this was the structure of how you approached that. You could have told this novel just simply through Annie's point of view, and it still would have been wonderful. But instead, we get Annie's point of view of the iceberg, then we get Graham's, we get his ex-wife's point of view, and we get some of his children's, which I absolutely loved. So I wanted to know, how did that come about? Did you know this was always going to be the structure, or did you decide on that?
It came about sort of, I mean, the novel took me 6 years to write. So I made a lot of decisions and then thought after, 3 or 4 months, well, that's not going to work, is it? And changed things. And I made one very long false start, which was at the beginning, when I thought I was beginning it, with Annie's voice in the first person after Graham died. And there was something so sort of, it was just very lifeless, as you might say, because it was dealing with seeing things through her grief. And I just didn't, it just wasn't any good, really. And several people that I'd count on to sort of look at things told me so. And I knew it really right away, actually, as soon as they said it. I just thought, oh yeah. But so I started again a second time with Graham, with the notion that it would go back and forth between Graham and Annie. And instantly the prose just was just much better. I mean, because he is such a lively, energetic person, and the prose kind of partook of some of that liveliness, and that carried me through the rest of it. Actually, it just changed the way I was writing it, and it changed a little bit my idea of how I would construct the book, which then just happened essentially. I mean, when the idea that we sort of have met both Graham and Annie by maybe page pretty early, by the 50th page or so, and maybe a little bit more than that. But it's third person, and it moves in and out very much, so that sometimes you're just sitting in their brain essentially, and then sometimes I can draw back. I love the third person. I mean, because it gives you so much fluidity. I mean, you can sort of talk about someone, and then you can say he thought this, but really he didn't recognize what he was thinking was.
Right,
I mean,
right.
Jump around a lot, in and out. And so by the time Graham dies, which is fairly early on in the novel, but not that early, maybe 120 pages. I haven't really sort of looked at it. Then I suddenly realized it, and everyone was sort of in place at that point. There are 2 children. One that Graham has had with his first marriage, but he's off stage. Lucas, who's in his late 30s, and then there's Sarah, who's the child of Graham and Annie's marriage, and she's also off stage at that point, as is Frida. But we know about Frida a little bit more through Graham's ruminations.
Right.
But then Annie has to call people, so that you sort of get these people, and then I thought, I'm gonna go with them after they've heard, essentially. And that was sort of delicious. So it just evolved in that way. And then I was very interested, once I'd introduced them and sort of stayed with them for a few minutes, Sarah and Lucas and Frida, I just wanted them to continue to be there. And so that at that point, I think I began to have this notion of the novel, which I've talked about elsewhere, but as sort of like these sociograms that I used to have to do.
Oh, that's one of my questions I was going to ask you about. Can you tell us what a sociogram is?
Yeah. We did it in sort of psych classes, and I did it a lot in observing young children. I was getting a degree in early childhood education at one point in my life. So you draw a circle, and around this circle you put the various characters whose interactions you want to watch, and you just wait. And something happens to one character, or one character does something. An action occurs of one sort or another, and that strikes this person down here very personally, very profoundly. Or maybe it strikes 2 of them, and they react, and their reactions cause this person up here to be very profoundly affected. and it's just a tracing of these lines of reaction from one to another, even back to the original actor, so that you end up with this wonderful web.
I was going to say that's what I call a character web. That's incredibly.
Another way.
But I like what you called it better. But that's incredibly an intuitive way of doing it, and it really knits together a whole bunch of diverse characters.
And it goes on forever. I mean,
right.
And so that these interactions, these reactions and responses, and the sort of what they evoke in other people just keep making things more and more and more complex, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah, I loved it. And I also loved that there's very much a theme of the novel as photograph, almost, to me, in the sense that you can take the most realistic looking photograph, and depending on the angle that you're looking at it or the lighting or whatever else, it's going to have a different meaning for you and for other people. And I thought it was really, really interesting that you made Annie a photographer, and especially she has this one picture of what she thinks marriage looks like, and she thinks it's fantastic, and the critics say, well, that's a cliche of the rumpled sheets and everything else. So I wanted you to, if you would talk about the connection between her and her creativity, not just with photographs, but also her creativity in the terms of how she sees and shapes her marriage.
Well, I think she's aware of it from very early on, from the very first chapter, which I wrote later, but essentially it recounts their meeting, and her sense of, at first before she's taking Graham really seriously as a possible partner or anything like that, she's just having a great time. She's just very surprised by how great their sex is together, and she falls in love with him and he with her. But he's a very powerful person, and she's a slightly recessive person.
Mm-hmm.
And her daughter at one point calls her unknowable, and she is a little bit, just because she's reserved. And she has the sense, even though they're very happy together over a long period of time, occasionally it says in the very first chapter, she will have a sense of his having sort of overtaken her. And sort of, doesn't say it, but sort of swallowed her whole in a way, because he's just so much more dynamic than she is, and so much more turned out to the world. And she's sort of not there with him, essentially. She's with him, but sort of following along behind in a certain sense. And that comes to be important to her after he's died, because she regrets it more than that she wasn't more, that she let him do that to her in a certain sense. Not that he meant it in any unloving way, but he did sort of overtake her life in a certain way.
Do you think that we're all really unknowable in some sense?
I think there's an argument to be made for that. and in part, I think we're unknowable to ourselves, and life may be a sort of slow discovery of what's under there, really, I think. And that is true in this book. I mean, I think one of the things I wanted to do in this book is have Annie in particular come to understand herself quite differently by the end of the book. That was important to me. And it happens with other of the characters too. I think the closest is actually Frida, the first wife, who's very much involved in this group. I mean, Graham has wanted to hold on to her as he wants to hold on to everyone and everything. And partly because they have a son together, and they live very nearby, and the son is in and out of the house. And so it makes sense that Frida is also a part of this family group. And the children are more like siblings than anything else, really, except there's a big age difference, gender difference too, between them. But Frida too comes to a different and pained understanding. Annie's she's grateful for her increased understanding. But Frida sees what's happened to her over a number of years, sort of living at the edges of this very warm family, being included in it, but but not being at the very center of it in any way.
But I think that that whole notion of, you know, coming to new understanding of yourself, I think I've seen that in your other novels too. Certainly in The Good Mother, where there's the whole thing about what happened with her boyfriend and her child, and how do you choose to look at that? And part of how you choose to look at that has to do with the cost of that incident. And in While I Was Gone, also sort of deals with what you believed about a relationship in the past and what you think is happening now and what happens when you realize what happened. But you also said that the book that you wrote about your father, you said was almost a prelude to writing Monogamy. Can you talk about that? How was
I
it?
wrote about it a little in the advanced readers edition that sort of went out to reviewers and critics and so forth, but it's not anything I wrote about in the novel. The novel just, I hope, stands by itself. But my dad was a very gentle and learned man, and my mother was sort of hyperdramatic. My dad was just steady and very fine and very loving in his sort of quiet way. And he was an historian, church historian, and a deep believer in God. And he contracted Alzheimer's disease, and he came to live near me for I'd lived closest to him of all. My siblings were all scattered, and so I'd lived closest to him through the time when it seemed to be me that he was becoming ill. And it was harder for the others to see it because they just weren't there that much. But then he went out to stay with my sister for a couple of years because he thought he was going to go to a retirement community, sort of ecclesiastical retirement community in California.
Oh.
Didn't take, which he would have loved, actually. He was looking forward to it. But it turns out they didn't have any way of taking someone with Alzheimer's disease. And by then we knew he had it. So the great question was, where would he go? And he came back east, and I was the one in charge of him. And it was just a very agonizing experience, as it is for everybody who's got someone they love who's suffering from it, and increasingly disappears, really. And
right.
He was hallucinatory. He was paranoid. He got very, very frightened. So in a way, it was a relief for him to die. Actually, I was glad he died in that sense. But I just had this very long, difficult grieving for him. It just seemed so bitterly unfair to me. And I suppose part of that was terror of the same fate in some way. I don't know, but I just couldn't resolve it, really. And I thought if I wrote this book, if I wrote a memoir about, actually I wanted it partly to be, and it was, about the disease itself. Because the stuff they had for you to read at that time, which was in the late 80s,
was terrible.
It was horrible stuff. I mean, it was just sappy, and you learn to knit. Perhaps that would keep you happy, stuff like that. So, and then it wasn't very easy to understand it because the other sort of version of literature you got about it was so medical and so technical. It was really hard to get what was really happening. So I tried to write a book that presented the science on it very clearly, using my dad as an example of these various stages and so forth. But I also wrote about him and his life. And then in the course of the book, I got a lot of letters from his friends, and I looked at his letters. He'd carefully destroyed all his communication, his written communication with my mother, because I think he felt that was very private. But I had a lot of his letters from friends and at various episodes in his life, which made me understand him very differently as I worked on the book. I worked on it for about 10 years because it was so hard. Then I turned to fiction again, which I would just, thank God.
Right, you can go right. You can go in a whole different world.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you talked about feeling bitter and angry, because with Annie, she's so angry at Garth's betrayal that it almost overwhelms her sense of he's gone. And
yes, that for the moment seems more important to her than,
it seems more important.
I mean, she's been
her.
very grief-stricken before she discovers that he actually had been having an affair with someone, and so the grief is just very, very real. And then she feels so betrayed even in the grief. I mean, she was mourning him so deeply when he was just awful. I mean, she says at one point to her friend, to Frida, that she wishes he would be alive again so she could hit him. And then she says at an later stage that she wishes he'd come back to life so she could kill him. I mean, she's just furious, and every memory she has seems a sort of false to her, of course. And then there's the whole question of what was real and what was false, and everything that went on between them for all those years. I mean, how could she believe she had this wonderful relationship with him if, in fact, this was possible, that he could have been having an affair? And she actually doesn't know very much about the affair. She doesn't really know what it meant to Graham, and if she could have known certain things, she might have not been quite so angry. Certainly she would have been shocked.
Well, that's what's so interesting to me. There was this really great French film, and I wrote down the name because I wanted to talk about it, and of course I can't find the name of it. Yeah. But it was about this guy who had been in the war and shell-shocked, and when he came back home, his only beloved son was killed, and he just was so depressed. And then he had another shock. And in his second shock, he became this very happy person who forgot that he had been in the war and that his son had been killed. And the question of the film was, well, how are these people going to keep that knowledge from him? And is it better for you not to know and stay happy? Or is it better to know the truth and then realize you have this great sorrow and then you have to grieve through it? Mm-hmm. I mean, what do you think? I don't know. I think I would rather be ignorant and happy, but.
Well, I don't know. I mean, would it have been better if Annie never knew? Probably so. Probably so. But it does sort of take her on a trip to know that. And it's something that I think it really is better by the end that she knew it, and
she does know that she would, because she had the tools to work through that and handle that. Yeah. I wanted to talk about your origin story, because it seemed to all of us that all of a sudden you burst on the scene with The Good Mother, and it was a sensation. It was an extraordinary book. And I told you before we got on here that it was one of those books where I felt it changed my life, and I still have my copy of it. But along with that, I read recently where you changed publishers and editors, and when you wrote to get a new agent, you introduced yourself as if, who in the world would not know who Sue Miller is? I mean, I thought that was so amazing and so wonderfully humble after all these, we all consider you a literary legend. So I wanted you to talk about your origin story, how you became a writer, how you got A Good Mother published, how you felt about being what to everybody else seemed an instant literary giant, and how you managed to stay so humble now and so down to
I'm not humble.
Oh, you're not? Oh, you certainly seem like you are.
No. But it also, the notion that I came out of I'd published, it's true, just some short stories here and there, and finally, mostly in literary magazines, finally in The Atlantic, which was, gave me $2,000 at the time, which was ridiculous to me. But I'd been writing essentially all my life. So even as a child, and in high school, I won the National Scholastic Writing Award, which is probably, for that
it's
age,
a big deal.
Person is it's very most competitive thing I've ever, won. And there are various other really well-known writers whose names I wouldn't have known at the time, who also won it, but Joyce Carol Oates and Truman Capote, John Updike, and others. So I didn't realize that it was that big of a deal, but it was a big deal to me. And I just was very pleased with that. But that was just one of the, I was just always writing. I never thought of it necessarily as a career.
What did you think of a career? I just had to interrupt to ask you.
I didn't know anything about a career.
Okay.
I just didn't know what I was going to do. And I ended up actually working in daycare for about 10 years of my life because I had a child, and it got me home before he got home. I sort of worked a 3/4 day, which most people in daycare with a larger center worked. So anyway, I was writing all the time, but I had a kid. I was a single mother for 13 years or so, and I was working. And so I wasn't writing a whole lot. And then at a certain point, I just decided, okay, bear down, Sue. You need to take this more seriously, and you need to sort of try to make something of your life that's going to work, maybe. And So I I took a couple of classes, writing classes, because I just never finished anything, because I guess I wasn't thinking of it as a career.
Right.
Just write and write and write and sort of have these semi-stories that didn't have an ending. And I thought, okay, then I will finally have to be in charge of the shape of something. And so I did. And actually the very first stories I wrote for that class, the first class I took, were taken not till several years later, because it sort of takes that long to get them out to a literary magazine.
Right.
And, I mean, they were turned down all over the place too, but they got published in very nice little literary magazines. And I was sort of trying to work on a novel off and on through that period. I actually wrote 2 unpublished novels, one in my early 20s, which I just trashed at a certain point later, so awful. And then one that I wrote over the course of a lot of that time that I was, teaching, and my kid was little and so forth, very slowly, but I finished it finally. And it also wasn't good. I think what I was doing was sort of learning how to write a novel, which is not an easy thing to know how to do.
No, it is not.
Yeah. But the third novel that I wrote was The Good Mother. And by the time my first published story was published in a literary magazine called Plowshares, which is a really fine literary magazine. And in the little blurb at the back, sort of bio in the back, it said, this is her first published story. And I heard from people because of that. I heard from people who wanted to represent me.
Wow.
Because I think they thought, oh, maybe she doesn't have one. And as soon as I said, the question was, did I have a novel always? And I said, no, because I didn't really. I had this idea for a novel. And the one person who didn't ask that was a woman named Maxine Grofsky.
Right, I know that name.
Yeah, who took me on with just short stories and no guarantee of a novel at all. But I produced a novel over the next, I think, about 2 or 3 years. And she saw in it what I didn't see in it, which was that it was going to be a good novel, and it was going to also be a kind of sensational novel in some ways.
Wow. And how did that make you feel? I mean,
she never said that.
She never said it. She never said it to you. Okay. Because if someone had said that to me in my first novel, I would have been paralyzed.
Exactly. And I think she knew that would happen if she said, this is going to be sensation. I would have said, well, first of all, I didn't want to write a sensation. I thought of myself as writing a serious novel. And that seemed not what I wanted to do with work. I remember at one point telling her I wanted to send it into a literary contest, which would give you, I think, $5,000 and the promise of publication. And I needed the $5,000 really badly. And she said no. And for I was so pissed off at her.
But she was smart.
Give me $5,000.
But she was very smart. That was the right thing for her to say. So once the novel was published, when all the publicity started coming out and you knew that it was a sensation, how did you handle that? I mean, how did you feel? Did you start writing another novel immediately, or did you? How did it change?
I started getting ready to write another novel, but it was a little disturbing to me, because I really sort of thought I understood what my life was and what it was going to be, and suddenly it was very different and not really in my control in a certain way. I felt, which I felt my previous life was in my control, and I was the boss of it. So it was complicated in my life. And one of the things that I felt, actually, that there wasn't such a thing as a book tour then. So it was a sort of
that's right
at the very start. So that, there were some very, very fine reviews, including the one on the cover of the New York Times, which at that time could make a huge difference to a book. I don't think it does so much anymore, because things are so much more diffused. I mean, that was the reviewer of record kind of at that point.
Right.
So many more reviewing organs, as we say. But so it was pretty clear that it was going to be well received, and it was in most quarters, not in all quarters by any means.
No, really? Not in all?
No.
Well, how could they possibly say something that wasn't an accolade for that book? That's so strange.
I think people felt it was I don't
Maybe
know
it
if
was
you
the
remember,
Times.
but it was at the time there was all this stuff about child abuse in child care centers. There were the McMartin case out in,
Oh, yes, I remember that.
yeah, I actually mentioned it in this book, but it was a very hot topic, whether daycare centers, whether, all kinds of things about that.
Right,
And so a
right.
couple of reviews just accused me of being exploitive about it. I mean, I started the book well before any of those things happened, but that's not the way they saw it. They saw it as someone like me glomming onto this sensational
I
aspect of,
don't think so. I think the thing that I love so much about the book is there were no real villains. I mean, I think her boyfriend made a choice that in the moment he thought it was an okay choice,
yeah,
and yet the repercussions were so terrible for it.
yeah.
And if that was going to be a sensationalized novel, he would have made a very drastic choice where everyone would look at it and say that's definitely child abuse.
No, and it wasn't at all the way I thought about it. So I was sort of shocked. But it was a very ad feminem review, that one, and then a lot of the feminists hated it too.
Really?
Yes,
That's surprising to me. That's really surprising. Well, actually, I shouldn't say surprising to me because people will glom onto all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, in terms of your writing, do you feel like you learn something new from every book and you can apply it to the next book you're writing, or do you feel like every book is a brand new thing and none of the old rules apply, that you're just sort of looking in the dark? Yeah, I was hoping you were going to say that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I just feel as though, I might know a lot about writing the last book, but I know nothing about writing this new book. And it feels to me as though every book has its own rules and its own needs and its own skills that it wants you to have, which you may not have practiced before, and you may not be sure you have them, and that sort of thing. I mean, and each book is just hard to get launched into, as this one was, the monogamy was. I mean, I think one of the things that was true about The Good Mother was that I had been thinking about it for so many years, because I just didn't have time to launch myself into a novel. I would have been my age now if I'd been trying to write it while I was doing these other things. So I was making a lot of notes for it. And by the time I got a grant that allowed me just not to work for about a year and a half. And by the time that came around, I already knew the book very well. And so I was not in struggle with it as I was so much with monogamy at the start, because I didn't know it. I just finished writing another book and it was time to write a new book, and it was especially daunting to me somehow.
Yeah, it's sort of always like that. I wanted to know, I wanted to talk a little bit more about what kind of writer you are. Do you have, I mean, I have right beside me, I have about 20 different colored folders with different notes about characters and this and that. And do you know the shape of your novel before you start to write it? I mean, do you have an idea of what what the bottom of the iceberg is, so to say, and how it's going to end? Or are these discoveries that you make along the way? And how do you come to those discoveries? Do you make a lot of notes or outlines, or do you just leave it to intuition?
I make a lot of notes. I write in longhand, and I have books, bound books that lined notebooks, essentially, that I make notes into. And that's how I figure out what I want to do before I start. And that's how I make notes about characters as I'm sort of beginning to think about their entry into the book and what I want to have happen with them. And I really do feel responsible for knowing how a book is going to end, what it is that I want people to get out of it in one way.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that. I a lot of writers I know feel that, if you know how a book is going to end, why write it?
Yeah.
And I always feel like that's the skeleton, and the creativity comes with how much flesh you put on the skeleton, and the muscle and the clothes and the earrings and everything else. So I'm very, very glad that you said that, because I feel that too.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we had John Irving on here, and he said he doesn't write a book until he knows his last sentence.
Yeah.
And I find that it's very, very helpful. So I'm building on it. I wanted to ask you, I forgot what I was going to ask you. Oh yeah, what advice would you give writers, if any?
These are people who are beginning to write, or
beginning to write? Yeah, beginning writers.
I would say just to read and make notes on everything they're reading all the time, even to write copy sentences that they just are struck by and adore, just write them out. It's sort of like muscle memory to sort of
I
have
like
words
that.
arranged in a certain way that you admire, and you don't really think about why you admire them or what you might learn from them until you kind of copy them or write them out, or in some way really imprint them on your own mind. But just a lot of reading, I think. And then I would argue, actually, if they're thinking of writing a novel, to think of, not to be in any rush. I mean, I do think that I benefited enormously from believing, really, as I was writing the first couple of novels that I wrote, that I didn't know anything about it. I needed to learn how to write a novel, and the way to learn how to do it was to write one. As you would with a short. You wouldn't expect the first short story you wrote to be really good or published or whatever. And I think you shouldn't expect your work to be fabulous right away. I mean, I think you should be patient enough to really want to present the work that you think is just marvelous.
I always feel that. I always tell my writing students that when they're having a day where they feel like they just should give it up and go to dental school and it's just terrible, I tell them that's actually a sign that your subconscious is churning and that the next day it'll be a lot easier, and you should learn to love that state of being. I wanted to ask you about, I guess because this is something I'm deeply curious about, my own feelings about, which I haven't figured out. Are you going to, I feel like I don't really understand how I feel about COVID, and none of us know how it's going to end. And a lot of writers are talking about, well, do we place, or does that mean that all our next books have to be set in 2019 instead of 2020? Or can we write them in 2020 and just have sort of COVID as background music? Or do we set it in the future when it's gone? I'm basically avoiding it right now, but I was really curious about how you're handling that, or if you're thinking about it yet, or if or anything.
I'm not thinking about it yet, but I'm sure that there will be really fine literature that emerges from and interesting literature that will emerge from this particular period of time, with the combination of COVID, with the Black Lives Matter and all the sort of great complications about that, things that over and over again we've tried to work out in our society and just haven't managed to at all. I'm rereading a book by John Hersey called The Algiers Motel Incident, and as I read, I'm just struck. It could be yesterday. The police violence and just the futility of talking about it with the police. Anyway, so that I really think there'll probably be some very good nonfiction written.
I think the nonfiction
right away. But my guess is that the fiction will take longer until some things are sort of resolved about.
I agree.
The meaning of it socially. Meaning of it.
You have an audience question. I don't know who the name of the person is, but they asked, have you ever been stuck as a writer, and what do you do to become unstuck?
I make more notes. I just sort of just sit down and make notes. Why is this not working? And I actually write those words in my notebook.
That's interesting.
Because I just sort of argue, but they're not words. I love this because they're not words that I'm in any way, they're not going to go in the book. They're just a way of writing myself out of it. And it doesn't always work right away, but I just keep at it. I mean, I just keep making notes to myself so that all of my rough drafts are longhand with all the scenes interspersed with all of these weird notes to myself. He could say this, and that would be, and it just sort of looking at all the options and trying to play them out on paper, but not in words that I'm thinking of as being part of the book. They're words to myself.
One last question. Do you have a lot of people who read your pages before you submit them, or do you feel like you just want to give it to your agent and see what your agent says and then send it on? And if so, do you have different people, like maybe somebody who's good with psychological issues, somebody else who's better with narrative drive, and do you pay attention to what they say all the time?
Too much. I have, I did after I'd finished my partner read the 100 pages that I wasn't sure of and was happily, he had to tell me no, in addition to, but my my two former agents that I had, because I wasn't sure about that. But usually I wait until it seems really finished to me, and then I show it to my partner. Okay. And he's very good. He was an editor at one time too, so he's a writer. But I don't like to bother anybody, and I also just don't want to hear from anybody about it until I feel I've done with it. I don't really want other people's opinions on it, because
really
I just don't want to hear from anybody. It just slows me down. They could be right, they could be wrong, but I have to think about what they think, and I have to, once someone said to me about a character, "Oh, she would never do that," and I thought, "Up yours." Charge of her, don't tell me what she would never do.
Right.
I mean, I just feel as though I don't like it. Actually, I don't like sharing my work as it goes along with other people, because I don't welcome their comments on it. And if I don't welcome,
that's really interesting, and I love hearing this. I once, on a very early novel, had somebody tell me, every writer has a novel that should be burned. I think this is yours. It went on and it was published and it did just fine. But she was actually mad. I mean, sometimes people get irritated, like, why didn't you take my advice? Oh, here's another question for you. Okay. How do you feel about the movie and miniseries made of your books?
I haven't watched them, so there's that. I actually did watch one movie because I had to, for a sort of a fundraising event. I had to go to the movie, watch it, and then talk about it to this group.
Oh no!
But I actually saw the in previews, or what now we call trailers. I was watching another movie, and up came the trailers for The Good Mother, and I had the experience of sort of hearing these lines I'd written being spoken in a way that weren't exactly correct. They should have spoken them in a different way. And I realized that was going to be my response to the whole movie. That it just wasn't exactly the way I thought of it, and that I should just not do that. It wasn't going to be completely satisfactory to me, no matter what. And I think my partner again saw it, and he thought it was a very good adaptation, but I just didn't want to see it.
Oh, see, I thought the adaptation of that book was, I guess it's the difference between I don't know. I didn't feel that the characters were the characters that I knew from the book. Mm-hmm. That was the thing.
Even though they're just never be the exact characters.
Yeah.
I just didn't want anyone else's version of those characters, or the way a certain line was said in my head. I thought it was from my head up for one.
Well, I am just so thrilled that you were here. I'm so happy to have hosted you. I love Monogamy. I love all your books, and Monogamy is just, it's brilliant. I'm reading it through a second time now and sort of underlining things. And I think I want to tell everybody, we have a link to bookshop.org where you can not only buy the book, but you can help support independent bookstores. And Sue Miller, we are so honored at the Blaze to host you. This was just spectacular. Thank you so much for speaking with me, and I can't wait to read whatever you write next.
Oh, God willing, I write something. Thanks so much, Caroline.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, Sue.
Bye.